So welcome everyone to Fabric for Mere Mortals. I'm impressed there's so many of you in the room at 9 a.m. It is kind of early in my opinion, but I guess some other people might be morning people on the other hand. So what we're going to be doing in this session is trying to figure out how to make sense of Fabric, since I would believe that all of you have heard about Fabric in some extent. And well, it might not be quite as simple as it seems. So if we go back a little bit of time, in 2019, there was something called Synapse Analytics that came out in Azure as a data platform solution. And that was supposed to bring all the capabilities that you could ever need for a data platform together in a very easily integrated, manageable manner. But if any of you have used Synapse at any point, tried to set up networking, anything like that, you have probably been just like fuming and thinking like, how can this be so hard? This was supposed to be integrated and easy to use and everything just fits together. So that wasn't quite the truth. On the data side, we've of course had also Power BI around for a very long time already, and that is really widely used for reporting needs, visualizing our data, bringing our data to life. And so as the latest evolution, we've got, of course, Fabric that came in already about a year ago. So Fabric came in claiming the same thing as Synapse did, with a little bit of a different twist. These are the pieces that will fit together nicely. They are nicely integrated. You don't need to have to do any work, and everything just works. There's, of course, different twists to Fabric, and we'll get to them in a bit. But the tricky thing might be, once you get started, is that you figure out that, wait, there's all these different experiences. There's data engineering, there's OneLake, there's data warehouse. How do you even figure out which components to use from each of those? And that can be a little bit mind-boggling in the beginning. So that is why this session was created, to make you figure that out a little bit easier for you. So to do that today, we're going to first set the stage for just figuring out why would we need a data platform, what are we trying to do. Then we'll start to go deeper into the different experiences and artifacts that you can find in Fabric. And then lastly, we will briefly look at what would a full solution look like. And well, if you want to hear more about Fabric, there will be a session from Vesa, who is sitting in the front row here, later today, that I heard will be mainly demos, so you will get more hands-on aspects of Fabric as well. So if you want more, make sure to go there as well. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Heini Ilmarinen. I work at Polar Squad here in Finland. I am a DevOps consultant I do that work with a data twist on the go as well. I'm a data platform MVP, and I actually do go around quite a bit in data side events to speak around the world. But this is actually my first conference in Finland, which I find a little bit weird. I've been doing this for some years now, but I've never actually talked in a conference in Finland. So I'm really, really excited to be here and actually be able to speak in Finland as well. I am a 1/3 of the Knee Deep in Tech podcast, where we talk about Microsoft technologies from all kinds of different aspects. And then kind of my angle to things always comes from the architecture side. How do things fit together? That's what I always want to figure out. How do you put them together in a meaningful way so that you make something that you need happen? I was actually supposed to become a math teacher initially, but instead I'm here today. So I am maybe a little bit of a math nerd at heart, at least. And as you might have seen, I'm a bit of a serial doodler. I like to make sense of things by drawing them out. And so I decided, well, that's a good way to make slides as well. That's why you see so many of them today as well. All right, so let's get started. Just first setting the stage. Before we get there, how many of you have heard of Fabric? Okay, I think that's all hands. How many of you have tested it out in some way? Played? Okay, not that many. How many are using it in production? Well, maybe Vesa is the only one who is eagerly pointing their hand up. So not very many are actually running Fabric in production. And yeah, you're in the right place if you've heard about it but haven't maybe gotten started yet. So hopefully this will help you get going a little faster. So if we think about data projects, we always have some kind of data that we want to work with. We have some kind of data sources that we are interested in. That is kind of, I think, the common thread for all kinds of data projects. We want to bring some kind of value out of our data, and that means we have some data in our source systems, and we need that into our data platform by loading and ingesting it somewhere. For that, of course, it will depend on our data source, whether it is more a batch load that we need to do. Do we need to set up some kind of event streaming? What kind of ingestion do we actually have to make for our data? So there are variations there. Then once we get the data in, we want to store it somewhere so that then we can efficiently serve it, because that is the main point, that we want to serve it. But in reality, once we bring the data in, we most likely need to do some kind of transformations on it. We need to do some kind of analysis on it. That can vary quite widely depending on the project and what kind of data you have. But a lot of times we do have to do some transformations to actually find some kind of valuable new data from the data that we bring in. We might need to combine it with another data source or something like that. And then the point that brings us value is when we actually serve that data. It can be a visualization through Power BI, or it can be that you serve that data to an end application, or you create an API. The varieties there are quite wide. Of course, in a lot of the, I think, Microsoft documentation and reference architectures, we see Power BI there, but it could be something else, depending what do you need your data for. So if we look at any kind of data project, we can probably find these stages in some way or another there. And so then the question stands, what do we need from a data platform to actually be able to do these things? We kind of need the capabilities to load and ingest data in some way. We need some kind of way to store the data efficiently. We need some kind of way to transform and analyze it according to our needs. And then we probably need some way to serve it as well, unless we take it outside of our data platform, somewhere else. So if we then flip it around and start to look, well, what do we then need from a data platform? And if we look at that from the Fabric perspective, but actually this first point applies to any kind of data platform, modern data platform at least. So we need some kind of layer where we will store our data. Of course, that is kind of evident, I believe. But then when we are looking at the more modern data platforms, we are not talking about this at this day and age that we have one SQL server where we rule it all. And in these modern data platforms, we have kind of separated the storage layer and compute layer. So we actually need some kind of metastore layer, which is going to help us make sense of our data. The metastore layer is what defines what is our table, what is its structure, and things like that. So even if we store our data in the storage layer in even like a binary format, then we can make sense out of that data for ourselves, even if it's a flat file behind the scenes. So the metastore combined with the storage is what kind of brings us that data structure capabilities for us in these modern platforms. Then we, of course, need some kind of compute to be able to run our transformations, ingestions, and so forth, what brings the power for actually be able to do something with our data. And then a lot of times we also need some orchestration. These are kind of the minimum capabilities that we need. Of course, some platforms have some additional capabilities as well, but this is something that we need at least for our solution. So if we start looking at it from the Fabric perspective, for the storage layer in Fabric, we have something called OneLake. I have very mixed feelings about this word, and for them calling it the OneDrive for data, I don't think that is a positive marketing term, in my opinion. But, you know, everyone has their opinions. But the storage layer is OneLake, which is essentially built on top of Azure Data Lake Gen 2. So having a hierarchical namespace enabled in an Azure storage account, essentially. So that means that if you've been using an Azure storage account as a data lake previously, you have a lot of the same capabilities with OneLake as well. It has the same structures. behind the scenes, even though we don't see it so clearly in front of us or when we work with it. Then if we look at the Metastore layer, that is where things start to get interesting, in my opinion. They start to maybe get even a little complex. So if we look at the Metastore layer, we have these different structures that you can create in Fabric. We have a Lakehouse, which is one option that we can create. A Lakehouse consists of tables that you define based on the data that you have in your OneLake. But we also have an option to create a warehouse. And the warehouse behind the scenes uses, well, a new iteration of a SQL engine. It is not a pure SQL, Microsoft SQL. It is a new iteration. So it doesn't work exactly like an Azure SQL or Microsoft SQL. Then we also have the compute layer that actually in Fabric ties very tightly with the Metastore layer. So if you're using the Lakehouse capabilities, the primary way to the primary compute you use would be the Spark compute to do that. And then on the warehouse side, on the other hand, we would use warehouse capacity. Well, those are, of course, in Fabric all kind of managed for us. We don't have to necessarily take care of them unless we want to customize something. But the interesting thing in Fabric is that the Metastore layer and compute layer link very tightly together. So if you are running things in a warehouse, then you are using the warehouse capacity. And then it means that you are using those toolings to work with your data. So you're using SQL, not T-SQL, but a variation of SQL. And then if you're working on the Spark side, you are mainly using notebooks. We'll go into a little more detail in how you can, well, work together with these as well. But there's this very tight tie between the capacity and Metastore that we use. Then if we look at the orchestration layer, there is also something called pipelines, which is the Azure Data Factory capabilities brought into Fabric. And then we also have Data Flows Gen 2, which are familiar from the Power BI side previously. So if we look at all of these things, and then we look at them in the Fabric context, we can see that there's a lot of components that are familiar from previous services. So for example, the Spark compute capabilities were in Synapse already before, but the Lakehouse structures are a little different than what was available in Synapse. And then the warehouse might first feel like it's maybe the SQL pools from Synapse Analytics. But in Synapse, we had dedicated and serverless SQL pools, and this is not either of those. So this is kind of a new iteration of that as well. It's trying to take the best of both of those worlds, of the dedicated SQL pools and serverless SQL pools. But it's not kind of backwards compatible with either one of those. So that's good to note. There is actually like a third thread for Fabric that we can look at, which is more linked with the streams and event-based processing that you might need to do. So even on that side, we have its own house. So we can see that we have lakehouses and warehouses, but then on the stream side, you can create an event house within which you can have your KQL databases. The last I checked, the event house was still in preview. So there are still capabilities coming in there as well. And then on the compute, if you are going to run your queries on that side, we are going to have the Custo engine behind the scenes, again, powering those queries that we run against our Metastore. And then for the orchestration, we have event streams. So there is quite many options to kind of like what kind of direction you can go. And of course, to be able to decide between any of these, we need to have a little more information about what each of these are. But by now, we've kind of set the stage. We know what are the main purposes of a data platform solution in general. What do we need from a data platform to make that happen? And how does that map to the Fabric capabilities? And now we're going to start to dive deeper into experiences and artifacts that we can find in Fabric and see also a little bit in practice how to use them. So before we head there, just kind of to remember as we're going through all of these, kind of the basics about Fabric. When we're talking about Fabric, we're talking about a SaaS platform. They call that it has a SaaS foundation. in the marketing material. Not sure what that exactly means, but essentially when you are working with Fabric, you don't set up an Azure resource. You just sign up for the service, and then according to which Entra tenant you are in, you kind of get linked to that specific tenant of that service. And this has, of course, a lot of implications. It means that, for example, for the computes, you don't have to set up anything to get going. There are kind of default computes available for you from the get-go, but there is some options to customize. But since it's a SaaS platform, it means you don't have infinite possibilities in how you can customize. There is some restrictions in place, what you can do and what you cannot. That means that we have to evaluate Fabric as we would any other SaaS platform. Do we trust it? Are we going to trust the kind of security capabilities it offers, for example? And based on that, are we then going to use it in our organization? Because it's a SaaS foundation, it also means that we don't necessarily buy it as an Azure resource in the same way, but kind of Fabric has taken on the licensing that was already in Power BI, plus then added their own capacities that you specifically need to run Fabric. And I think currently the mode is very complicated because you still have some of the Power BI licensing that only applies to Power BI, and then we have the Fabric capacities that apply to everything in Fabric, including Power BI as well. I hope that in time that will get a little clearer, but kind of the one thing to note that if you do have an Azure subscription, you can buy your Fabric capacity through an Azure subscription as well. So you can create it there and then link it to your Fabric workspace. And one of the core foundations of Fabric is that it has a centralized data store, that you don't need to move your data multiple times. You don't need to duplicate it. Once you have it on your data platform, then you can use it anywhere in Fabric if you have access to it. So with that, the logical place to start with is starting with OneLake. Wow, that went well. So I'm just going to take this all out because I have clearly made a mistake. So if we would look at OneLake, that is the storage layer for Fabric. When you sign up for Fabric, when your organization is using Fabric, there is kind of one OneLake, that doesn't sound right, one OneLake that gets associated to your organization, to your tenant essentially. And so when you start to structure your Fabric workloads into workspaces, then each of those workspaces creates a container essentially, if you're familiar with Azure storage. So that creates essentially folders for you that separate each of those workspaces. Then as you start to create the different meta stores, those get a folder within the workspace that you create them in. So if you create a Lakehouse in workspace 1, you get a folder with that name. And then if you work with the files, then, that did not go as planned. If you work with the files, then you get a folder for that. And then if you have subfolders within that, you get subfolders. And then you have your files within there. So we get these storage structures into the OneLake that then does allow us, if we need to, we can kind of figure out how is our data stored in our OneLake, where can we find each of our data tables, and so forth. And we can find like a link that we can use to communicate with that. But if you this is just like one metastore in place. In this picture, you have a Lakehouse, and then you have the folders in there. But if you create many, then you, of course, will, within one workspace, start to have many, many folders that separate each of those workloads that you might be using. And then when you have the next workspace, again, the same happens. So there's going to become quite complex structures in place for this. So if we start to look at the data engineering side, which is one of the ways that we can, of course, work with OneLake, the main way that the main experience within data engineering is that you create a Lakehouse metastore. You structure your data in tables within your Lakehouse, or you have some raw files in there as well. That is an option. When you create a Lakehouse, there is kind of two sections in the Lakehouse that you might be using. While, of course, behind the scenes, the data is stored in OneLake. But those two sections is you have this files section where you can just, for example, you could upload your data in there manually or by a process. But you have also this tables section. So those will create two different paths within your OneLake storage if you use both of those portions. While you create a lakehouse, you get actually two other things as well. You get a SQL endpoint. So that is what enables you to query your data in your lakehouse by using the same SQL syntax as you would on the warehouse side. But this is a read-only endpoint. So you can query the data, you can make even some nice analysis on it, but it is a read-only endpoint. That's good to know. And you also get a semantic model, which is the model we would use then to link our Power BI report to. So that gets automatically created. You might need to go in and modify it, but there's one that gets created for you automatically. And most likely, I would say you want to do something to it before you start your reporting building. On all of the experiences, we also have the pipeline capabilities, the orchestration capabilities for us there to leverage, so that if we do need to schedule something, if we need to, for example, put two different transformations to happen one after the other, then we can use the pipelines functionality to do that. And since this is something that is very heavily based on what we had in Data Factory, it means that we have all these connectors that can enable us to connect to our data sources, all these activities that help us make our transformations, and then we can, of course, decide a destination that we place our data in. And of course, behind the scenes, OneLake is where that data gets stored in those structures that we went through just previously, and it kind of ends up in a nice way, structured way, though maybe a little bit complex. And then the main way to work with your data is with notebooks within the data engineering experience. So notebooks consist of cells that you can have either code or even comments in. And then those are what you would run against your lakehouse as kind of the primary method. There are other ways as well, but that is the primary way. So kind of the notebooks are the main way that you interact with your data on the lakehouse side. But as we can see, if you use the data engineering portion, there's quite many things that get created behind the scenes. Just by creating a lakehouse, you end up with a SQL endpoint and a semantic model to start with. And then you also have all these other aspects there as well in a full solution. If we compare this to the data warehousing capabilities that we have, yes, apparently my clicker died. So if we compare this to the data warehouse capabilities, within a data warehouse, the metastore that you would use is called a warehouse. And this has more like the typical structure of a regular SQL database. We have schemas, and we then have tables under that. So it is more, we get this three-level reference that we can use to reference our tables that has the warehouse name, the schema, and the table that we have then under that schema. So you would use more kind of for structuring, you would use more those maybe familiar concepts that we have also from more traditional database modeling as well. But what to note, what I also already said before, and to really highlight, is that the warehouse is not the same as Microsoft SQL. The SQL syntax that we use is not exactly the same as in T-SQL. So there are some little differences there that you have to take into account. But just as with lakehouses, the data is stored in OneLake behind the scenes. You get a new folder for your warehouse when you create it, and then the data gets stored under there. And then you, of course, have the same kind of like basic capabilities within the data warehousing side as well. You have the pipelines and data flows and things like that that you can leverage as well. If you would want to bring these kind of two experiences together, it is possible. For the lakehouse, we, of course, have the SQL endpoint that gets created behind the scenes. And if you would want to reference let's say a warehouse table in your notebook, in your data engineering experience side. That is possible. If you're in the same warehouse, you can find the link to the data. Where is this data stored in my OneLake, and reference that in your notebook. But if your warehouse happens to be, for example, in another workspace in Fabric, then you would need to create a shortcut to your Lakehouse to reference that table, and through that, then you would be able to query or kind of use that reference to the table in your notebooks as well. So there is kind of integration between the different experiences, but in some cases it can be a little more complex to set up. It doesn't kind of work out of the box. Because for me, if I'm told you have a unified platform, you are able to access whatever data you have access to, I would think I can reference my warehouse table from anywhere in Fabric. But that is not always the case. If I'm in a different workspace, I need to create a shortcut. And of course, shortcuts can be used to reference things within Fabric workspace itself. So I can link to a table from a different workspace to my Lakehouse, or I can actually reference things outside of Fabric. So if I have data in my Azure Data Lake storage somewhere already existing, I can create a shortcut to it so that it's available and visible for me in Fabric directly, so that I don't need to move the data. All right. So we've gone through a little bit of the experiences and artifacts. And before we move to the next point, let's look a little bit hands-on about how does this all work. Interesting. So I will go back into my workspace. So by looking at Fabric, you can right away see that this is pretty much the Power BI user interface, but with different icons than there used to be. But the experience of working with Fabric is very much the same as it used to be with Power BI. Also, a lot of the management features are in line with what we had in Power BI as well. And of course, I'm a person who actually likes infrastructure and setting up networking and all these things that are sometimes difficult. So kind of when Fabric came out, I was a little bummed that I don't have I don't need to do that anymore. Why not? That is the fun part. But I guess I've gotten a little over that, and I'm happy to get going. Can you see at the back of the room? Should I make it bigger? Okay. See nodding. Is that bigger or I can see? It's fine. Okay, it's good. Let's go with that. So I've created a Lakehouse beforehand called Igloo. Very, what is this? Creative, I would say. And I actually have, as we can see, when I've created that Lakehouse, it creates a semantic model and also a SQL analytics endpoint for me as well, so I can work with that data in those two ways. And if I go into my Lakehouse, then I can see that I have this files portion. Let's see if I actually have some data here. It's always interesting that you need to refresh it even though the data is there. So I've created a subfolder that's called raw data, and within that I have some data in a yellow taxi folder as well. And then I can also have some tables in the table side if I would have some. So that I don't have yet, so we're gonna go ahead and kind of figure out how one could do that, for example. So I prepared a notebook. So this is essentially kind of the main way of working in the Lakehouse side. I really like Spark, PySpark specifically, and you kind of only, the sky is the limit on what you can do, but it is of course coding. So we're gonna start from the beginning here. I'm gonna link into some of the open data sets that is available. We will see that I'm now using the default compute that is behind the scenes. And we will see that it kind of starts the session first. That was in 4 seconds. And then it actually starts to run the cell block of code that I have here. So I'm essentially just creating a path to the data that I want to fetch. This is a completely public endpoint, so I don't have to put in any authentication information or anything like that. So that is done in 25 seconds. a little maybe slow, but then if I want to check what is my data like, I can run a display command on that and see what does my data look like. I have been verifying that this works, so now it's doesn't take quite as long as it maybe does on the first go. Of course, what I might want to do is that I might want to bring that data into my OneLake. And so what I'm doing here is I'm giving it a file name. I'll actually put this to run because it takes a little while I'll explain. And then we can set this output path for it that references our OneLake. So you can see that in the name here, I have the workspace name here, IglooConf demos, as kind of the container reference in this URL. So this is the specific ABFSS syntax that we do, that we first have the container name, then we have the @ sign, and then we have the rest of the URL. So then we have the reference to OneLake specifically, and then I have a reference to my specific Lakehouse, and then I want this to go into the file section, into the raw data subfolder, and to the specific file name that I specified. So that is going to write some of the data from that data set in there. I'm not going to take all of it because it's quite a large data set. So I'm just going to take 1,000 rows for it because we just get to see how do we create tables and things like that. So that will all end up in our yellow taxi folder in a moment from this query, but this takes a few minutes, so I will just go on to the next one to explain that. The rest don't take quite so long. So what then, when I've written my data into my OneLake and into a specific Lakehouse in the file section, then I can reference that specific path and read that data using kind of the methods we have in Spark. And then, for example, in this case, I can add a column here. So we do the with column command, and we add a timestamp for the time when that was loaded in. And then I can, for example, filter by something. So in this case, we are filtering where this specific column is not null and ensuring that we don't have those rows that do have a null value there. And then once we want to load it to the table side in our Lakehouse, then we would do a write of that data frame and put this save as table section with the table name reference. And then we're just kind of displaying what was that data that we were actually writing there. So this previous cell is now done, so I can put this next one to run as well. And we can see if our data shows up in the table section as well. With the portions that are in the kind of the file side, we can see what kind of files did it create here. So this was just a Parquet file, Parquet format that we were using. So we end up with a Parquet file, which is kind of one of the default formats used. Once we get to the tables, that actually gets stored in Delta Lake format behind the scenes, which is kind of just built on top of Parquet that brings in some metadata that makes it easier to have like the proper transactional support and other things that we need in data platforms. So we see that there's actually our files there, and we can see that the next cell is ready as well. So if we refresh the table side, we should have our table, which I do not see now. Let's see. This is something that I have happen occasionally, that things just don't show up right away in Fabric, which is very fun for demos, where you would like something to actually show up. It would be fun if it did. That normally works. And we can see that our data frame that is there, it actually does return one row. Well, anyways, I'm not sure I can find now where the fault is at, but it would show up in the table side. Let's see if we go to the Lakehouse Explorer. I am doubtful that it will show up. Of course not. That is very nice. So let's see. We'll come back to this and see if it shows up. But essentially, we start to then have a list of the tables we have in our Lakehouse under the tables folder, which then allows to do more work on those as well. I luckily have one of my older demos. I haven't cleaned that up, so we can maybe look at it from that side if this doesn't kind of kick off the way it is supposed to. But so here's kind of a preview of the Lakehouse side. I think Vesa is going to show a little bit more of the warehousing side if that is of interest. But kind of the user interface is nice and easy. I have sometimes this experience that things don't show up quite as fast as I would like. But when things do work, they work quite well. For example, I really like the Spark startup time. It doesn't take long to get going if you use the default capacity and so forth. So there are good aspects here as well. All right. If we kind of continue in the last bit of this presentation, and hopefully we get to come back to the demos in a bit, what might be of interest is, of course, building a full solution, building something that kind of brings your data from the very ingestion point all the way to the end. So we kind of like, which components of Fabric would we use for each of these stages, from bringing our data in from a data source, ingesting it, then storing it, doing some transforming analysis on it, and then being able to serve it for our end users as well. So if we look at that, we have, of course, many different ways that we could go. So that is the tricky thing. We need to choose which kind of way are we going to take as we go forward. And if we look at kind of the first stream, let's say we have like a traditional relational database that we want to bring in. We use a pipeline to be able to just copy that data, for example, into our Lakehouse, into our files raw data folder that we had a similar setup in what we just saw. Then we might use another pipeline to actually clean that, make it a nicer table, something that we actually want to give as an option for our end users to use for their own analysis. So then we might write our data into a clean table, for example, in our Lakehouse. And then we could use Power BI to visualize that data, have that serving layer as well. Then, of course, as we might have some event streams as well, that would be kind of a different kind of stream, more hot data coming in. Then on that side, we could use the event house. We could also link directly to the Lakehouse from our stream and ensure that we also have our data available as a table there. Or we could go through an event house so that we have that KQL query capabilities for our data as well, if we're doing more on the fly querying of the data as we go. So as we can see, kind of figuring out the broad strokes for your platform might not be that difficult. Yes, you, for example, need to figure out, are you using lakehouses or warehouses, or what are you using behind the scenes? All of them do write data into the one lake, and all of them store the data in Delta Lake format. But if you are, for example, using the warehousing side, then that compute that is used does its own kind of optimizations on the data. So it doesn't mean that you can 100% use it anywhere else then. So you have to take that into consideration and think of that when you're planning your platform. How do you set the pieces together as you go? So you do need to decide a little bit like which metastores are you going to use. If you use just everything randomly for different components, then you will have to be able to then figure out how do you make that sensible? How do you make that easy for your users to understand what is happening, what component links to what? Because as we saw already there, it can be quite many things that end up in our Fabric workspace. Also just, I had created only a Lakehouse, only a notebook, and I already have a bit of a list of items in my workspace there as well. So think about when you start using Fabric, it's good to get going and start testing things out, but also think about what are you doing as different portions of your solution. Do you need more batch type ingestion? Do you need more streaming? Because for those, we then have the different components within Fabric as well. And with that, let's go back here and let's see if I have some data available. No, of course not. I've sometimes had it also happen so that somehow the data ends up in a different place than I intend, even though it should automatically, kind of the Lakehouse you have selected here, it should link to that. But sometimes I've had it figure that, no, I want to write this in a different Lakehouse in my workspace. So I'm kind of assuming that might be what is happening here. Yes. So I'm just going to switch real quick here, or actually, I have a former Lakehouse I've been working with. This unfortunately has a little too many things, but this is what would happen. We have a kind of a table for our data show up in our Lakehouse. The thing is that I cannot see the same way the data for this as I could for the files section. I cannot see the files themselves in this view, but I could, for example, copy the path to that table if I needed to reference it later. So we can see a similar path here as we could reference for the file section. We have a similar syntax, we just are under the tables folder here. And also if I would like to load the data, for example, I want in my next cell, I want to select from that table, then that would be an option as well. So I can ensure that I get the data that I want, that it looks the way that I wanted it to. So if we look at it, we see it's the same data. We also have the data load date time in there, and we are kind of good to go. Yes, I will maybe try one more thing with my previous, because here I had just referenced the table name, so I will just I should be able to reference the kind of the entire reference of the table, and that should be just as fine as well. But let's see, I have not checked the syntax, so it's called Igloo. I have my, of course, doesn't like that one. Okay, I'm not going to get into it now, but somehow it wants to write it here in the wrong Lakehouse. So I think I might have somewhere behind the scenes this old one as a default for this workspace, and well, it wants to write it there, the data. So there is a way to reference, I want this in this specific Lakehouse, but I won't go into that now so that we don't lose too much time since the time is running out. So another aspect that we might be interested in is having kind of an event stream set up. I sometimes think that am I totally insane trying to do these demos, because sometimes with these ones also how the data comes in is not always so fast, but we'll just use the sample data that is available here. They are quite actually good data sets. Of course, in real life, you might have a little more discrepancies in your data. It might not be as clean as sometimes in these data sets, but it's a good starting point. So this is essentially like shared bike usage data, and they have like the docs where those bikes are in the different neighborhoods and things like that. So they have also now used how this event stream side works a little bit in the last few days. So as we can see as a destination, we can add either a custom app Lakehouse, KQL database, and Reflex. I'm just gonna put in our IglooConf Lakehouse here. And I'm gonna create a new Delta table. What I find difficult is kind of the actual event processor. It has been moved here, and the user interface is horrible in my opinion. What they did for this, because I can never figure out how to properly zoom in here. So pretty much what you can then do here is you can set up if you have any other operations that you would like to add. We could, for example, do a group by. I'm sorry, I'm going to zoom out a little bit because otherwise I'm not able to see anything. So for example, we want to know where is the biggest amount of bikes. So I, of course, have to have this linked to my data source first before I can actually do anything. Of course. And sometimes it does this, which makes complete sense. I want to get that out. Thank you. I am not a big fan of the current user interface, as you can maybe tell. It's not the best. So let's take the maximum amount of bikes. We want to know kind of where that maximum amount is. We're going to add that aggregation. And then we are going to do a group by the neighborhood that the bikes are in. And then we can set a window. Let's do a little more than 5 seconds. Let's say we want to know by the minute. And yes, that is done. I can close that. Wonderful. And then I can add that destination there. So the nice things about these is that you do actually kind of from the very get-go, you get the data preview available. But what is a little tricky, this does have a little kind of warm-up time. You have to be a little patient, which is not always so easy. So you will need to wait a little bit before you are able to see the data in your Lakehouse. So since we don't have the time today to wait, I will also show, unfortunately, one of my previous setups. So I will just switch here, go into this Lakehouse. It would show up exactly the same. We, for example, can have a table here. I'm not actually sure if this has exactly the same aggregation, but So what you can learn from this is with Fabric, there are really nice things, but things are a little bit weird sometimes. It does a little bit of weird things for you. So the data would end up in a table of its own in our Lakehouse, whatever columns we have selected. In this case, I actually did set the stream a little differently, so it won't have all of these columns with it. It will group it by the neighborhood as I did for the aggregation. I'm not very hopeful that it would show up here immediately. I've found it takes about 5 minutes before the data shows up. I'm not sure why, because the stream is on right away when you create it, unless you stop it. But it seems to have this few minutes kind of delay in when the data shows up. And if I now try to look at it here, it says, I don't have that table. But I'm like, I told you to create the table. But that is how it currently works. It takes a few minutes, so you can just leave it, check in later, and then you are good to go after that. But we are kind of running out of time. In Fabric, what you do is you then create all of these different components that make up your entire solution. They now have kind of the visuals in Fabric to help you kind of create your whole solution and link the different artifacts to the different points of your process. But again, that user interface is still quite horrible in my opinion. So I have not found a very good use for it because it doesn't really help you see which artifact links where. It helps you have the links, but it doesn't really help you map out this kind of architecture. What pipeline is in that first step, what pipeline is in that next step, and so forth. But it's maybe heading that way. And so, after we get to the end here, we started from just like figuring out the landscape of data platforms. Where are we at the moment? What kind of capabilities do we need? Then we went a little deeper into some of the core experiences and artifacts within Fabric. As Fabric is so huge, it's not possible to go through everything in 1 hour, or a little less actually. So there's a lot more to know there still. And then we looked at how would you actually pick and choose the different components for being able to build a full solution. I would also always say simplicity is the key. So if you can get away with using less different types of artifacts, that will make it easier for the people who work on this, and it will make it easier for you in the future as well. So thank you so much for joining. You can find me on LinkedIn and the former Twitter occasionally. Feel free to reach out to me and connect. And yeah, I think we're kind of out of time, so if you have any questions, feel free to come up here and we can chat after the session. Thank you so much.